We're going to discuss Nigeria's housing deficit challenge and how there are certain institutions that have been put in place to address just that particular development. Whether you're rich or poor, shelter is quite important to your existence as a human being and of course as a Nigerian for this particular conversation. Now, available data indicates that Nigeria will require more than 21 trillion naira to bridge the current housing deficit in the country. Now, this was quoted by Nigeria's Vice President Kashim Shettima during one of his engagements, that the nation needs to urgently construct about 28 million houses, adding that despite several interventions, the housing gap remains huge. Now, one of the federal government's housing interventions has been the National Housing Fund, which has initiated since 1992 to provide mortgage financing. Now, on Daybreak this morning, we'll be putting the spotlight on this particular funding and how Nigerians have been able to objectively get affordable housing that could guarantee some sort of affordable living in this regard. And to help us unpack some of these developments, we're joined by Oladapo Fakeye. He's the General Manager and Group Head, Strategy and Performance Management at the Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria. Also joining us in the studio to help add value to the conversation regarding to developments in the housing sector is architect Dayo Babatunde. He is a developer here in the Federal Capital City. Gentlemen, good morning to both of you, and thank you very much for joining us on Daybreak. It's good to have you.
Thank you very much.
Let's start with your understanding of the housing deficit and what you think is at the heart of this particular challenge. I'd like to start with you.
All right, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. So Nigeria is a developing economy, just like a whole lot of other economies. And we are saddled with a number of challenges, one being the fact that we have a very huge population in the country, and we have one of the highest population growth rates in the country as well. So when you look at that, the fact that we have a burgeoning population, and you look at the opportunities for housing development, there's a huge mismatch regarding that. So to build a house takes a lot of investment. So when you're talking about one unit of housing, you're talking essentially the need to provide millions of Naira to provide one unit of housing. So I think that's sort of highlights one of the major challenges we have, that you need a huge lot of funds to provide one unit of housing.
It's capital intensive.
Exactly. And when you have to juxtapose that with the fact that the population is growing, households are being formed regularly and they need their own housing units, and then when you cannot get the funding to match the demand for housing, that raises the issue of meeting the gap. And I think that expresses why we have this issue we're facing currently. From
close examination, from 1991, the housing deficit was around 7 million.
Yes.
In 2007, it was 12 million. In 2010, it was 14 million. Now we're talking about 28 million as of last year based on available data. The problem seems to keep multiplying. Where's the solution?
So there's a number of steps that we have as solutions. One is the National Housing Fund, to create that pool of funds for Nigerians, for which Nigerians can access affordable housing or housing at affordable rates. There are other options in terms of government intervention in providing housing. There are other solutions in terms of even the private sector coming in to provide housing solutions for people in need. But all in all, you need the cooperation and collaboration of all stakeholders essentially within the system to provide the solutions that will be needed.
Okay, so the Federal Mortgage Bank is an actor. It's just like a tripartite kind of agreement. And a lot of figures, 28 million, that's a lot of figures if you ask me. Is it that bad? Because I listened to the former Minister of Works, Babatunde Fashola, saying that the 28 million housing deficit is not true. So coming from you right now, how bad is the situation?
Yeah, so there are issues around what exactly is the housing gap that we have in the country. And a lot of people, you depending on the source you go to, you have figures being brought up. Yes, I think we want to admit that we are not where we should be in terms of adequate housing, and Nigeria is not the only country. Virtually every country has issues with providing not only the adequate number of housing that's probably needed, but in terms of the quality as well of housing needed. Even in advanced countries, they will tell you there are slum areas and we need to provide the kind of housing that will be quality for the kind of their citizens. So issues around what is the actual number. I think we all want to admit the fact that yes, there will be there is a housing deficit, there is a housing gap, even if not in terms of the fact that Nigerians are basically not sleeping under the bridge or whatever, but people are finding solutions
that
to
to
their housing needs, right. Even whether it is formal or informal. People do meet their needs. So because of the figures now, do you think it's because we've not had our population census for a few years now? Because our progression for the population growth is about 3.2%, which a lot of people have estimated to get this number. Do you think that, there will be a time where some people will be sleeping on the bridge, like a lot of people, because of this deficit? We hope not. But as I said, the major issue is that the census is a major issue, because the census will paint the picture at a point in time of what the situation is. And I think for those of us in the Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria, and a lot of us in the housing sector as well, it's we are deeply interested in what the outcome of the upcoming national census will be, because number one, it's going to tell us how many housing units we have across the country. It's going to tell us how many people are living in those houses per unit, and probably kind of give us a factual picture of what the needs or the gaps are. So we're looking forward to that eagerly and very anxiously. So because the figures that we will get from that will also help in planning. Because once you can dimension what the gaps are, what the challenges are, and most probably what the needs are and where the needs are, it will help you to plan and meet those needs going forward.
And Architect Baba, today, let's get some private sector perspective on this development. Talking about the gap and the deficit, this is the window of opportunity for businesses, and this is where you come in. Give me your understanding of what we're going through right now, because developers are a part of the solution. I mean, looking at what we're going through right now.
Yeah, thank you. Looking at it from the private sector perspective, I still largely feel, in the same way with the former minister, that it's not actually as bad as we may think, it is. Because really there are still developments that are not probably captured, that people are able to access. People still privately develop their own, housing, in one way or the other. And I feel, by the time you put all that together, it may not be as really bad, as,
according to the CBN, back in 2019, it noted that only 10% of Nigerians who desire to own a home can afford it. We're a country of 200 million plus people. 10% doesn't speak well about, how good we're doing, to be honest, right?
Yeah, it's not really, but to be honest.
Why is housing unaffordable to Nigerians in your view? I mean, with the fact that we have the housing fund, we have the Federal Mortgage Bank to ease all of the processes of owning it. Resources are not necessarily available for people to at one time mobilize and get their own home, build their own homes. Why is it unaffordable at this point? Even with the intervention of developers like you in the sector?
Yeah, because really it's not only the funds that, is a factor. The land, access to the land is also a major factor, especially when you talk of titled lands. I keep saying it, the fact that Kuje, for instance, is an area council. Does not mean it's not in the Federal Republic of Nigeria. So why are lands in Kuje not titled, properly, that people can as well access even the commercial banks? Some people may be able to access the commercial bank apart from, putting all of the pressures on the Federal Mortgage Bank.
But according to the Land Use Act, all land belongs to the federal government.
Yeah. So, but the truth of the matter still remains that not all these lands have the proper title that you can actually take to the bank, even to access funds.
So why is that?
Yeah.
Why do you have that?
So those are part of the things we are looking at, that, the government can be properly informed to make sure that maybe the Land Act is adjusted in such a manner that, this land really carry a proper title that can be, a tangible document for the banks. Because I feel, the Federal Mortgage Bank may not just be enough. There are other people who will be able to access funds from even the commercial banks if most of these lands are properly titled.
Now, give me an idea, as a business, how viable is it to be a developer in Nigeria? I know obviously the situation in Abuja and places like Lagos is obviously, that's where the big markets are, but across the country, what is it like to be a developer as part of a solution to this housing deficit that we're discussing? I mean, obviously it's a business opportunity, you make money from it, but you're also trying to create solutions.
Yeah, to be honest, it's viable throughout this, country because of the population, we are talking about here. There is no part of Nigeria you do housing that is still not a viable, endeavor. And as a matter of fact, it's an area, where you can absorb a lot of unemployment. It's housing in any circumstance, in any sector, you discover that it's something that can really take a lot of unemployment off the street, And
because of the construction.
Yes, the construction aspect of it, yeah.
So, Mr. Fake, now the mortgage bank, now, like I said before, is a tripartite kind of agreement where, the government provides the loan, or the land rather. The private investors come with the funds and the expertise to actually build these houses, and then the mortgage bank comes in as a middleman. First of all, my first question to you is housing affordable in Nigeria?
Housing is affordable in Nigeria to the various categories of income strata. The inputs to the housing may be where the challenges are. So you have the high income. People are building houses, millions, hundreds of millions. People are affording them. You could also build houses of 5 million or less, and people could afford them. So across the strata, yes. So the inputs is where the challenges are. So to get a basic, to get a plot of land anywhere in the country, urban or rural area, there is a starting level. So what would the cost be? To process for the necessary approvals will take some time and will attract some cost as well. And then to get the financing for it. So macroeconomics indicators are the issues that make it unaffordable. And then, of course, on the other side, you have inflation, been in the 20s digits for quite some time. Following the devaluation of the Naira, you have a lot of other issues as well with the cost of the building materials. But on the other side, income has not risen sufficiently to accommodate all of these costs. Okay. And that creates the challenge of unaffordability.
I actually asked this question because I'm looking at the future for the youths, people who are still in school, who have not started working yet, and have this prospect, like, I want to own a house in Nigeria. But the people who are already in the market, I mean the labor market, are still struggling to own a house. I hear a lot of people say, I've been contributing to the housing fund, but I can't even locate where this house is. I haven't have an idea of how I am going to get my house. Is it when I retire? So what's this all about? The contribution to the, housing funds and not even knowing what you're doing at the same time? Where's the problem coming from?
All right. So it's good to set the context for that. Thank you for that question. So that's why you have something like the National Housing Fund. And the whole idea is every Nigerian who is working in the country contributes a certain percentage of his or her income into the National Housing Fund. The rate is 2.5% of what the monthly emoluments are. Is contributed into the funds, and by that you create a pool of funds, pool of long-term, low-cost funds. And Nigeria is not the only one that has used this approach. In the Philippines, they have their own sort of National Housing Fund. In Mexico, they have their own version of the National Housing Fund. In China, in Singapore. So you have various, across the world there, across various economies, you have variants of the National Housing Fund. And the Nigerian government in 1992 thought to come up with the National Housing Fund. So the idea is individuals, workers contribute into the funds, and on the basis of that, they can get access to the funding at low cost. Now, the major challenges with housing finance, we have established further that it's capital intensive, so you need a huge pool of funds. The second challenge really deals with the tenure of the funds. Now, so imagine you could get a loan probably of 1.2 million, and you are asked to pay back in 1 year, meaning you need to pay back 100,000 Naira every month. But imagine you get the same loan of 1.2 million and you are required to pay back in 12 years. That means you are paying the 100,000 in a year instead of a month. Simply because it's the same loan, it's the same amount of money, but because it's excuse me, the tenor has been stretched, it makes it a bit more affordable. That's the whole concept behind the National Housing Fund, that you have people contribute into a pool of funds, and then individuals can get access to those funds at long-term rates.
But 2.5%.
2.5%.
How realistic is that in today's economy? I mean, 2.5% of your income, especially, I mean, considering the living condition crisis that we have right now. Nigerians don't have a living wage, we have a minimum wage. I mean, 2.5% of your monthly income doesn't look like a significant sum to me. Realistically, as far as the challenge of resources is concerned, what does that say about the purse that we're pulling all these monies into? Is it enough?
Yeah, so it's not enough because and actually when the National Housing Fund was the idea was brought up, there were actually 4 sources of funding for it. Apart from the workers' contribution, you had to have banks make mandatory investments in the fund. You had to have insurance companies make mandatory investments in the fund, and of course also support from the federal government. But right now what we have essentially is the workers' contribution. The other areas will not be able to actualize that for now, but with what we have, we've depended on the workers' contribution, and that is what we're using as. So for the individual, 2.5%, it's what could be affordable or what is convenient for them. So we want to explore other sources going forward of having enough funds into excuse me, into the National Housing Fund.
Right. Just to allow you to catch your breath for a moment, if we could get back to Mr. Babatunde, Architect Babatunde, for a minute. You look at the current conversation right now. There is a lot of scandal that I think with time we get to unpack about remittances, about how the organized labor feels about the housing fund itself. But talking about affordability, right? Developers look for the money wherever it is, whether it's from the housing fund, whether it's from commercial banks. You build, no matter how tough the economy is, somehow you guys are able to find the money to build your facilities, your estates, and all of these other buildings. But when it comes to the affordability of paying for those houses, I do understand that there are some of those developers who are in partnership with, whether it's the mortgage bank, for instance, to allow for an ease to the payment where it can take the shape of long-term payment before someone owns that house. Give me an idea as to how people have been able to explore that opportunity to great effect so that they can own a home they can call their own.
Thank you. I think more of the problem is with awareness. You know, it's always very, very simple, especially with the Federal Mortgage Bank. Like he mentioned, the contribution many people felt the amount they are contributing is actually what, you know, we amount to the price of the house they want to buy. And probably that's why most people like not able to pursue to know exactly, you know, what the National Housing Fund, you know, looks like. Because if you ask an average civil servant, what's your contribution? He may tell you I've been in service for 8 years, and they are taking 2.5% from that, from my salary every month. Maybe it's not more than 2 million. So even in his own mind, he believes that 2 million cannot buy him a house. But that's not the idea, actually. It qualifies you now to be able to access the mortgage. So at that point, they are now able to do what they call affordability, you know, in the bank, where you are now able to, to assess you based on the number of years you have in service, you know, that you still have left in service, and you know what your income
cover your payment.
Your payment, exactly.
But how easy is it for people to do that? Because it is one thing for it to be in plain black and white on paper, but what is the reality of it? What is the success level of people taking advantage of this opportunity?
To be honest with you, it's quite easy. They've made it very easy, and everywhere I go, I said
think very easy is a fair way to, to analyze.
Yes, it's very easy, really. But like I said,
when you have to give
the
30%,
real challenge,
when you have to give 30% down payment on the house, I don't think that's very easy. If you're a civil servant, for instance, you see a development here in Abuja and you want to afford it, say for instance 30 million naira, right? And the developer says, listen, it's covered by the housing fund or the mortgage bank, but you have to give us 30% down payment before all the other paperwork can cover the rest.
Plus all the hidden charges.
It doesn't seem as easy as you're making it seem.
To be honest with you, I think the problem still lies more with awareness, because even the 10% you talked about,
I think 30% is what I've been seeing for the most part.
No, it's now 10%, mostly.
Okay.
You know, especially with the Federal Mortgage Bank, because they actually have a loan ceiling of about 15 until recently, where they are accommodating, people in other sectors, like, the petroleum sector and all of that, where they now, jack it to about 50 million. But to be honest, at 15%, the awareness is not there. You may not even have to drop this 10% at once.
May not. What if you have to then?
No, nobody really compels you. Even as a developer, you give people the time, and that's why I said it's nothing on this is cast on stone.
Give me the best case scenario where people can follow a particular process from beginning to the end, where they can actually own a home. Give me a complete scenario.
You. Now, there is something, a new program Federal Mortgage Bank launched, a couple of years ago, which is called Rent to Own. In the Rent to Own, you are also dealing with the cooperative. You can even start making the deposit with your cooperative. And your cooperative is even able to even weather it for you. So it's now become a micro arrangement between the individual and even the cooperative you belong to. And in the process, they call it rent to own. It's now like you are even renting. So you pay what you probably would have been paying on a monthly basis in your rent equivalent, on a monthly basis, even to own the house. So that looks, completely, seamless.
It doesn't look very simple to me.
It doesn't look very simple. It seems like a very cumbersome process. Now, you mentioned that, you have to access this fund and you get to a particular stage and then you start asking questions, which of course I feel like when you get to your retirement age, that's like the first step into getting your hands into what the mortgage bank and owning a house really starts from. Please, can you be clear on that? Because it seems like when I retire, that's when I start making my first step into owning a house.
No, it's not. You make your first step by, first of all, contributing to the National Housing Fund, and that puts you as part of the customers or part of the contributors, and that enables you, opens access for you to access any of the loan products and services. I will backtrack a bit to what we have, some of the discussions we have recently. As part of looking at to making it more affordable and seamless for people, we've had to reduce the equity requirement from 30% to 10%. We've opened up, as he has mentioned, other avenues for people to access. So previously we only had the
Are you saying,
the mortgage?
Pardon the interruption. Are you saying that all the flyers I've been seeing recently with 30% on them are not legal?
No, they're outdated.
They're outdated.
Okay.
I was given one recently, so I don't, as recent as last week, for instance.
No, that would be outdated. So the equity requirement is 10%.
10%.
So the individual puts in 10%, and then we give the loan of 90% of the value of the house. For houses that you can get for 5 million or less, we'll give you 100%.
I'm sure, Mr. Faki, there are no houses you can get for 5 million now.
No, there's just people who are working on that, and there are people who are delivering on that. So it depends on the cost of the land. So if you look at getting a plot of land somewhere which is not in the city center, is a rural area, you want to build your retirement home in a village, definitely the cost of land and the cost associated with construction will be far less. So you could deliver at that. It depends on the size of the house as well. If you're looking at a 2-bedroom, it's an area that is affordable in terms of access to land. I mean, you could achieve that. So and then we give 100% mortgage on that.
How long do you have to contribute?
You only have to contribute for 6 months, and that's part of what makes it also easy. 6 months contribution, and then you become eligible to access any of the loans and products. And our rates are at single digits. And I think there's something we need to also emphasize for Nigerians to know. If you went to the open market, you'll be talking of interest rates of 18, 20, 25%, depending on where you go to. But because of the fact that we want to make it as affordable as possible, despite the fact that inflation has been rising, despite the fact that cost of operations, even for we as a financial have been rising, we have consistently maintained 6% interest rate, and there are no easy charges. Okay, so if you're working with any of our
that's on the level of the mortgage bank,
yes,
right?
if you're working with any of our
independent developers, there might be hidden charges. I've seen worst case scenarios when the hidden charges.
Except you are not partnering with Federal Mortgage Bank.
Yeah,
okay.
If you are not, yeah, because that's where I want to mention, you know, when you mention the flyers, you know, there are developers that are not partnering with Federal Mortgage Bank.
I'm actually specifically talking about the ones that are partnering with
you know, it will be difficult for any of them to fly 30%.
And then I have to deal with service charges, for instance.
Yeah, that is now living in the estate.
Those are the hidden charges we're talking about.
Why do I have to deal with that? I mean, I own the home, I've got the coverage. Who am I paying the service charge to?
Good. There is a cost of facility management. That is the part really we've been having a lot of back and forth, even with a lot of inhabitants of the estate. You have to clean the streets. You have to maintain some services.
What if I want to do all of that on my own?
You won't be able to, because it is, take for instance,
I'm sure if I buy a plot of land and I build my house,
the transformer connecting electricity to the estate suddenly develop an issue. How do you fix it? It's running into millions. So and you are not the only one staying there.
Why is that compulsory? Because service charges are not optional. Last time I checked,
yes,
they're not optional.
They are not.
And don't you think it undermines the idea behind rent to own, for instance, and all that the housing fund is supposed to achieve?
The point is, for any gated community that has been created in the name of estates, that we call it, there is no way you must manage it. You must maintain security.
I expect you to defend that, but I want to hear from the government. let's hear from the Federal Mortgage Bank. Don't you think this is a downside to people who are trying to access some of these houses?
So let's understand what we're talking about. There is a cost of owning a house. So I get a mortgage and I repay over time. I become the owner of the mortgage. There is another cost of living in a house. So for every one of us, whether you're living in a gated community, whether you are paying an official service charge or not, you're still paying for the cost of living.
So the mortgage bank endorses service charges then?
No. You won't say because I'm living in the house, I'm paying the mortgage, I won't pay for my electricity, for instance. I mean, that's taking that every occupant of a house, once you're enjoying the utility, you must pay for it. The measure we have put in place as the Federal Mortgage Bank, because when we do fund construction of estates, what we do encourage is that the residents of the estate will form a residents association. So that's you and me as the residents, as the home owners within the estate. We have our own association, and then we determine what are the services we need. Yes, of course, our waste have to be evacuated. The environment has to be cleaned. Where we have to provide security for the environment. So what level of these services do we need? How much is it going to cost us? Okay. So it's going to be a joint decision by the housing association as to what level of services they want to enjoy and how much it will cost.
There's no doubt.
So it's not a hidden charge per se, because that is the cost
there's no doubt
of living
that those services are essential and they're very important. However, it is the fee that is the issue, because it runs into hundreds of thousands of Naira annually. And that's where a lot of people draw the line and say, listen, I can afford it to rent, to own the house, but I can't afford these service charges in perpetuity, because it's not as if you pay for 2-3 years. It is in perpetuity. As long as you live in that estate, year in, year out, even if you retire, for instance, it doesn't make sense that I'm going to have to churn out 200,000, 300,000 naira service charges every other year. Do you think that
it's even
feasible?
More than that for some estates?
So, speaking from my own personal experience, I happen to also live in an estate. So I'm talking personally from my own experience. So we've had the issues around that. So it's the reality of life. It's the reality of living in a state. What point I'm trying to make is that
you're not like 99.9% of Nigerians. I'm sure you can afford it.
I am.
I'm sure you can afford it. You're not an average Nigerian.
So we have a residents association, and it was put on the table. These are the services we need to pay for. We had a management who are members, considered members of the association and residents within the estate. So the issues were put on the table. This is what it will cost us to have this level of security. This is what it costs us to evacuate our waste. This is what it costs us to employ
so you negotiated your service charges.
And so it was mutually agreed. It was put to vote, and we all voted as stakeholders and as residents in the estate. And when we thought we need to increase the level of security within the estate, a proposal was made, and we looked at it. Of course, not everybody would agree to it, but we looked at the security checks. Life is more important than any other thing. So let's put it. So those are issues outside the Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria. So these are issues that individuals, we don't hands up. What we do is that part of the loan conditions to a developer is that once the houses are built and people have moved in, it is mandatory that there is a residents association to be set up and established so that the owners of the house can take their destinies into their own hands. So
you're creating a more democratic process where they can have some input. And even though I feel like most of the time the input does very little to change the fees that the developers peg, which I think on the back end gives them some sort of end. But let me get an idea of the subscription level. What is it like for the Federal Mortgage Bank over the years?
Okay, thank you very much. So with the National Housing Fund, we've been able to register a cumulative number of 5.6 million Nigerians who are contributing. And within the past probably 10 years, we've done probably 60% of that number. So there is that significant rise.
50% of 5.6.
Yeah, exactly. So, but we're still looking beyond that. If you look at the Nigeria Bureau of Statistics figures, they were talking about the working population. They tell you about 70 million Nigerians are working, whether in the private sector or the public sector or self-employed, about 70 million Nigerians. And the National Housing Fund is a national mandate. It's a universal mandate. Every Nigerian who is a worker contribute to the National Housing Fund. So we want to increase the level of awareness. We want to increase the level of the value we can add to Nigerians. So we're looking growing the numbers significantly beyond the 5.6 that we have. So we're looking at Nigerians, particularly in the informal sector, because the majority of the present contributors are in the formal sector, the public sector, in the private sector, but we're looking at the former Nigerians. And the truth be told, Nigerians in the formal sector are those who lack most of the access to formal housing.
Why is that?
Yes, simply because the nature of their informality usually does not give them access to formal getting loans and all of that. So to a large extent, they also feel removed from whatever government is doing. So we are a development finance institution. So our mandate is to see how we can expand the net and provide accessibility as well as affordability for Nigerians to own their own house. As Akizedai has talked about, the more houses you build, the more you create jobs, the more you grow the economy. And a simple analogy is, okay, if we can build 1 million houses and each house requires 5 doors, for instance, what it actually means is that you have a demand for 5 million doors. That means manufacturing companies would realize the need, and of course they will. I mean,
that is the indirect benefit, but the direct objective is to get people affordable housing, isn't it? So let's talk about coverage, and let's talk about the categorization of beneficiaries, for instance. It's safe to understand that when it comes to public civil servants, we understand how that works. You get that deduction on a monthly basis. It's not even optional at this point. The private sector also, there are a lot of people who are self-employed, and that act also covers them. Right? I want you to explain that, and also people working in the private sector, like this institutions, for instance. What are the chances of accessing it, and what do they need to do to access these loans?
Okay, so as I mentioned, the National Housing Fund is open to every Nigerian working to contribute to the fund.
Even contract staff?
Even contract staff, as long as you are earning an income.
Okay.
The law requires that you contribute into the National Housing Fund and enjoy the benefits as well. So we also need to understand what are the benefits. So the simple benefit will be you have the opportunity of accessing a mortgage loan. Usually in the country we have people who struggle to build their houses, and they build the house over 10 years, 20 years. Okay? Well, what a mortgage does is that it gives the opportunity of getting a facility. You build the house today and you repay back on your mortgage over the 10 years, 20 years, up to 30 years. Under the National Housing Fund, we extend the loan tenure to up to 30 years, depending on your age, to when you are 60. So the opportunities for everybody. We do not discriminate between whether you're in the public sector or private sector. If we do discriminate, is the fact that, okay, we recognize that if you're in the informal sector, you may not have the necessary requirements that a formal employed person would present. You may not be able to present.
You just say if you do discriminate.
So, so one of the probably a loan requirement may be a pay slip. But we know that somebody in the informal sector would not necessarily have a pay slip.
With the same 2.5%.
Yes, exactly. So what we want to look at is what you would then define what will be your average monthly income. You will declare that, and then you pay 2.5%. So where you need to provide documentation to support as evidence of having a means of income, because that's required for you to get a loan. So for the formal sector, a pay slip will serve that purpose. For the informal sector, we now ask you to bring your bank statements, for instance, as evidence to show that yes, you have some income, and then we can determine what you are able to afford, and then make you have access to those.
Under that 5 million subscribers that you talk about, how many of them are in the private sector, and how many of them are self-employed?
I may not
just give me an understanding.
Well, what I will put figures around, I'll be prepared to have that. But what I may put on is that about 20% of the 5.6 million contributors are self-employed. So 20% are self-employed. So we look around the 1.1 million or so. So we do have that offtake. We do have that interest from self-employed individuals. And in fact, that is the area we want to go into, seeing that a lot of more self-employed individuals, we may look at them as self-employed, but doesn't necessarily mean that they may not be able to afford.
Okay. Architect, I see your estate, for instance. I like the buildings and I want to access this. Do I go to you first or do I go to the mortgage bank? How does this work?
Well, you come to us first, you know, before, you know, the Federal Mortgage Bank. For instance, one of the things I think he also, you know, forgot to mention is the fact that Federal Mortgage Bank has recognized the informal sector by creating the cooperative estate, you know, development facility now, you know, in which people can come together,
pool resources,
yeah, exactly, as a cooperative, and that helps even the repayment for such individuals who are not, you know, working in the former areas. So that's an area where.
Yeah, but okay, say I'm an individual, for instance, working with this company, and I want to get a home. I see your estate. I like one of the buildings. How do I start the process from beginning to the end?
Exactly. So we actually, as a developer, we also assist, you know, the Federal Mortgage Bank in making sure that these individuals, you know, we're able to check their contribution. You know, they have a card. You know, we make sure that okay, it has been updated, and they take our
I'm eligible.
Form.
You ask the necessary questions.
Exactly. We try to know what is their source of income. We're able to break it down to their affordability. What would they be entitled to? And at that point, we're also able to advise them. If somebody may come, he actually like a 3-bedroom, but by the time you check all these details from him, you discover he can only afford maybe a 2-bedroom. Then you advise him at that point. So it is at this process, you know, that the packaging of his loan, you know, starts by gathering all his information, making him to fill all the necessary form, and then we forward.
Talking about those forms, the ones that come from the mortgage bank.
Exactly.
Are those forms easily accessible? I remember a particular experience with a previous company I'd worked with. I mean, there was a scramble to get those forms. It was limited. Everybody was contributing, but then I realized they brought 10 forms to an organization that had well over 100 staff members, right? And then at some point, they even had to form a committee and say, okay, listen, we're going to have to ration this out between department and department. Why are these forms hard to get for starters? And are they for sale also?
No, they're not for sale from us.
You're very sure of that?
Yes, I'm very sure of that. So let me also provide some context to that. So backtracking a bit, so what's the process? So I see a house that I love by a developer. I talk to the developer. I may be required to make probably some payments or down payment, and then he gives me a letter of offer to sell the house or the property to me. So I take that letter. I now approach, we call them primary mortgage institutions, because they will package the mortgage loan. So I go to a primary mortgage institution, I open up an account with them, and then I fill out their form. So this is where probably you have to pay for an application form from the primary mortgage institution, but it's not more than 10,000 Naira for a form. So I fill the form, and then the primary mortgage institution now collates all these loans, not just from me, but from other interested parties as well, and then forwards it to the Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria. We'll appraise the loans, and then we will grant the primary mortgage institution what we call a wholesale loan. So it's a bulk amount to the primary mortgage institution to on-lend to individuals. And that's what the NHF Act actually requires for a mortgage transaction. However, we have also opened up other venues or other loan products. So that's a mortgage transaction. We have now what we call a rent-to-own. So a rent-to-own means I, as an individual, goes directly to the developer and says, oh, I love your property, I'm interested in it, and I may not want to go through the route of going through a primary mortgage or a mortgage transaction. So FMBN has a facility, rent-to-own. So I get a letter of offer from the developer. I walk into any Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria, the nearest one within the vicinity. I get an application form. I may have to pay for the cost of processing the loan for that. And
what's the average cost of processing the loan?
It's a net total sum of 100,000. It covers a whole lot of things: the appraisal of the loan, the search with the registry, and a lot of other things. So the
forms are not actually free then.
They're not actually free then.
right.
But they're so cheap. So the Federal Mortgage Bank approves the rent-to-own facility for me. It means I can move into the house as soon as it's approved, and I pay what I should have been paying a landlord as rent is what I'm now paying for living in the house. But the difference is that whatever I'm paying is paying down, paying towards my ownership of that property.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the rent to own.
You get to own.
You get to own. So it could be a 20-year facility.
Yeah.
At the end of 20 years, I become the owner, and then I can then have the documents changed to my name.
For the developers, is there a threshold that I have to, as a beneficiary or someone trying to get a home, is there a threshold that I have to meet under rent to own, for instance, before I move into the house?
Yeah, basically, even the 10% in the rent to own program is not mandatory, especially if your affordability could cover the entire cost of the house.
Okay,
what about defaulters? What about defaulters? I mean, people who end up, for instance, in the private sector, maybe they have a business, it was thriving, and then unfortunately something happens to the business. We know how the economy is struggling right now, right? Someone self-employed, he doesn't make as much money as he usually makes. What happens down the line if the money stops coming in? What happens? Worst case scenario?
Basically, there is always a recovery system, if eventually you are not able to. But in most cases, you are given ample time. There is always that understanding. I've seen situations where people are given even up to 1 year, for them to be able to manage
a grace period.
Exactly. To accept people. It is now seen that perpetually you are not prepared to pay for.
And does someone 100% loses that home, or is there a way you can split the difference and say, okay, listen, you were contributing X amount, we can give you this amount, vacate the premises because you no longer own it? Or is the person down to zero now? He doesn't have the home, and he also doesn't have any money to fall back on.
Well, I believe I've not seen a scenario like that, to be honest with you.
But where is the cover here as far as insurance is concerned?
So there is some insurance cover in the events, the unfortunate events, the beneficiary passes on. Insurance kicks in, and the insurance pays up whatever is the outstanding balance on the facility, so that there is no loss at the end of. So the family gets to own the property at the end of the day. So that's what is provided for.
Okay, Architect Dare, before you go, all of the conversation we've had today, it's revolving about finance, cash, and a lot of people would think that even with the contribution in your organization, as a worker, as an entrepreneur, it revolves around cash. Now, a lot of people like myself will be thinking, how can we make this affordable, more affordable than it is? So is there an alternative to the use of, some of the building materials? Cement, for instance. Cement is very expensive. 2-3 years back, cement was, below 5,000 naira, and now we're having it above 5,000 naira. Are there some alternatives that can actually reduce the cost of owning a house or providing homes for Nigerians?
Honestly, this discussion has been on for years, and I've been part of so many conferences, seminars in Nigeria, and even abroad. They call it alternative building material. For me, it's not much has been able to, achieved in this aspect. When you look at it, even when you try to introduce alternative materials, in most cases, if they are not produced from your own country, they are still imported. And whether you like it or not, it's still, the price is still,
but
high.
we have local producers who could do who could produce very good materials that can match up with whatever we're importing into the country? Have we tried exploring?
Yeah,
some of
and that's why I keep saying that when you look at it, do we really call cement, an imported item?
No,
that is it. We have it. That's it.
I mean, there's a whole conversation how cement is even cheaper across the border, much more than what we're buying here.
Yeah, it was debunked anyway. In fact, at the end of the day, I think it was about Lomé or somewhere, and it is actually about 6,500 Naira equivalent eventually.
Mr. Fake, as we're wrapping up, let's talk about two things. One, there's this controversy where the House of Representatives Committee is investigating a matter around remittances. The Federal Mortgage Bank came out to talk about how, the sum of 26.6 billion was not remitted from workers' contributions by the IPPIS, and this was coming from the Federal Mortgage Bank itself. Give me an understanding of why that is, and also for people who are not necessarily interested in accessing any of these loans, whether it's renovation, whether it's rent to own, whether it's owning a house. At the end of the years of service, they just want their money back. What is the process of getting it? How tedious is it? And what can you tell us about that?
Okay, let me start with your last question. So I usually have this saying that every contributor benefits from the National Housing Fund, because even if you don't get a facility, either a mortgage loan or rent to own, or even a renovation, and we even have presently what we call individual construction loan. So you as an individual, you get a facility to construct your own house from the Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria. So even if you don't get any of those facilities, what you'd get is that you get a complete and total refund of every kobo you've contributed into the National Housing Fund, and you get it with some interest. So everybody contributes. And I know that's probably one of the things that have endeared a lot of workers to contribute to the fund, because I've seen a lot of examples of people who retire from service after 35 years of service or 60 years of age, and then before their terminal entitlements are being processed, they just get a lump amount of money from the Federal Mortgage Bank, and it helps to stem the tide, at least to help them stabilize over time. So the necessary process is essentially that the employer, there is usually a desk officer in employment, he collates all the necessary documentations, the letter of disengagements and other records, records of whatever has been contributed, forwards it to the Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria, and what the act stipulates that within 3 months, the fund must be refunded to the individual.
Within 3 months?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a lot of conversation surrounding the Federal Mortgage Bank and owning a house in Nigeria. It's a long conversation, but time is not a friend. I want to say thank you to Mr. Oladapo Fakeye. He is the manager and group head, strategy and performance of the Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria. We also have architect Dayo Babatunde, the CEO of Perfect Estate Developers Limited. Thank you, gentlemen, for being our guests on the show today.
It's a pleasure to be here.